You doing today?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me back on. I'm up in Canada, where it's really freezing, and we're trying to keep our mind off of that. So, you get your head into weird rabbit holes and books and things like that, trying not to, think about the weather. So that's I think probably why I get into writing my own books and going on doing podcasts and everything else. You got to stay occupied with something other than the drudgery and darkness up here. But
Wisconsin has a similar climate, and we've been sub-zero for the last like week and a half. So just inching back up to the 30s. So it's warm out now.
right, yeah, yeah. So I've been looking into some stuff I thought was pretty fascinating, and for me, when I get into that kind of mode, I like to try to share it with people and see where it goes from there. One of the things I've found over the years is that with my TikTok account, it was a perfect example. Was I
Mhm.
throw something out that maybe it's almost random, it's out of context, but somebody somewhere will pick that up, and then it can have a trickle effect where or a wave effect where somebody else will then say, "Oh," like a researcher or somebody who's also doing their own research. They can run with that, and it leads to places that I wouldn't have expected. So I'm kind of more shameless now, but just trying to throw out talking points on my Substack or on my social media. So this one, um, I've made a case for a long while that I think H.G. Wells is very underappreciated and underestimated by researchers into the New World Order, the conspiracy that we're always talking about.
Mhm.
And for the most part, um, people still just think of H.G. Wells as being a science fiction author. The Invisible Man and War of the Worlds and these different things, and his depictions of uh, science fiction were very important. That is what he's most famous for. But he was also very much a thought leader of an actual generation of intellectuals uh, on the Atlantic coast, in England and in America.
Mhm.
And I've recently found more evidence that I thought was quite like I'm surprised that I haven't seen this before. I think that's what really caught my eye was that I've never heard people talk about the relationship between H.G. Wells and George Orwell. And so I found, like, I knew, and I should tell people who don't know that H.G. Wells actually just straight up wrote a book called The New World Order, in which, you might say, well, okay, what is that actually about? It's pretty much exactly what you think. It's saying we need to get rid of federal governments, we need to get rid of national sovereignty, we need to have a world government, and it should be run by these benevolent technocrats that will make all of our decisions for us and ensure that we're all safe and taken care of, and they will provide everything that we need. We can't have individual states controlling their own destiny and having their own conflicting ideas, because that leads to bad things like war and trade disputes and greed and this kind of stuff. He also hates capitalism and the idea that uh, rich people can run away with wealth, and then there's this inequality and stuff. So it's really this very early and still completely resonant idea with what the global elites are essentially inching towards. Although the whole question is, why don't they just do it? Why haven't they done it? And what's stopping them? And what is the big plan? Is this all going according to their plan? Is it not? And this is where George Orwell actually comes in. And to me, it's very interesting because um, everyone assumes, and I've heard many people say when you look it up, that 1984 was a commentary on communism and on, Stalinism, and this idea of, you know, that he was basically looking at the Bolshevik Revolution and this stuff, and saying this could be our future if we're not careful. But I've actually found that George Orwell hated H.G. Wells. They're two British authors overlapping, although Orwell was younger. And so I have an article that I found. You can look it up very easily. It's called Wells, Hitler, and the World State, written by George Orwell. So, like, right there, you have this is during World War II. Uh, Wells, Hitler, and the World State. So nobody knows the outcome of World War II at this point when this is being written.
Right.
But Orwell has, H.G. Wells has been weighing in on it. He's been, you know, he's H.G. Wells thought that communism might be the thing to replace the West. He thought that communism might be the solution. A world communist dictatorship. There's a lot of things he actually liked about it. And,
So did many
Germany,
Americans early on.
yeah.
Yeah. Go
And so
ahead.
H.G. Wells, one of the lines here that I feel like is, uh, I didn't highlight here, so let me look for it. But um, he talks about the influence of H.G. Wells. So he says, but is it not a sort of parricide, meaning, killing your own parent, your own father, for a person of my age, 38, to find fault with H.G. Wells? Thinking people who were born about the beginning of this century are in some sense Wells's own creation. How much influence any mere writer has, and especially a popular writer whose work takes effect quickly, is questionable, but I doubt whether anyone who was writing books between 1900 and 1920 at any rate in the English language influenced the young so much. And once you realize Wells wasn't just writing science fiction, this really is like a perfect window into the past where these things were taking root. And the idea of this global government, the New World Order, was really, still just up for debate. It was still fresh on people's minds as the wars were happening. And these people are thinking, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? That was the whole idea, is that the United Nations, the World Federation, as H.G. Wells called it, would prevent wars from ever happening again because everything could be controlled and mediated and regulated from the top down. And Orwell here in this essay, he talks about how H.G. Wells uh, doesn't appreciate the irrationality of people. Like, here's another quote from him. He says, um, "Science is fighting on the side of superstition." Um, he says, "It is impossible for Wells to accept this. It would contradict the worldview on which his works are based. The warlords and the witch doctors must fail. The common sense world state, meaning, this world government, as seen by a 19th century liberal whose heart does not leap at the sound of bugles, must triumph. Treachery and defeatism apart, Hitler cannot be a danger. That he should finally win would be an impossible reversal of history, like a Jacobite restoration." Meaning, and he makes this point over and over again. That's just one quote, but um, that H.G.
Break that
Wells,
a little bit.
sorry, what's that?
I was saying if you could break that down a little bit, how do you
Yeah.
interpret that?
So what he's saying is that uh, H.G. Wells is a stuffy intellectual who um, sees the world as progressing from nationalist, barbaric, self-interested, small-minded countries towards a sane, orderly, transcendental sort of big picture rationality where things in the future are going to all be scientific. They're all going to be sterile and well measured and proportionate, and you won't ever have a dictator again. That just doesn't work anymore. And H.G. Wells is saying there's no reason that doesn't work anymore. Just because technology has advanced, just because science is the order of the day, science can be used by people like Hitler to commit even greater atrocities, to do even worse things than any warlord would have hoped in the past. And so it's not just that there was the Dark Ages and this medieval sort of brutality, and then science came in, and now we're progressing towards this utopian future where all problems will be solved by this world state. It's that, you know, that's why he mentioned something like, his heart leaping at the sound of a bugle, just this sort of raw, patriotic,
Mhm.
irrational call to arms. We're just going to go out and kill people. We're just going to go out and, you know, Orwell understands that side. And if you read 1984 with that in mind, you actually get a much better commentary there, because 1984 is very much about the control of passions, the control of language and ideas, to the extent that, they have their, I forget exactly what it was called. What is it? The 4-minute rage, or
Uh,
um
the 2 minutes of hate, or
two
is it?
minute hate. Yeah, it was whatever it was. There's a couple minutes of hate or whatever where they were gathered. Normally they were completely docile and pacified and numbed. And then that, Orwell understood, would mean, you have all this pent up, bottled up frustration and angst, because your life sucks so much, and on some subconscious level, at least, you realize you're being lied to and everything is horrible, and so there needs to be a vent for it. And so that's why in his story there's this thing where they show you a video of these horrible things where women are being shot with machine guns, and all these atrocities are happening on the screen, and then you can just let out all of your passions at once, and it's a very controlled sort of passion. It's kind of a reflection of Orwell making fun of what kind of, how you would have to manage a new world order.
Right.
Um,
Because the passions are still there, but people need to vent that, but at least you can provide them as the scapegoat and vent that away from the systems of power toward the assigned scapegoat, but still
right.
acknowledging that it's there underneath the
Yes.
surface at all
You just have
times.
to direct it somewhere so that it becomes useful, and then you can go back to being, just a animal, essentially, just a insignificant being that doesn't really, have a intellectual life. It's very
Is
obviously extremely anti-intellectual, just like, um, you know, newspeak, destroys the whole language to the point where people can't express ideas anymore. That's kind of the central plot device of 1984, is the fact that just people can't express themselves anymore because they've taken away all the language. And that also is sort of a parody, or um, uh, a counter proposal, I guess you could call it, to H.G. Wells, where H.G. Wells imagines that the education level of everyone is going to get better and better and better, and that the ruling class genuinely might have the best interests, because H.G. Wells was not trying to be evil. That's
right.
almost sort of the horrifying thing about the New World Order, is that it really does believe that it has the greater good in mind, and that it can solve the world's problems by just controlling everything. And they
Mhm.
will provide you an education. They will tell you what good opinions are, what bad opinions are, and which direction mankind has to go. And they will use science to justify it. H.G. Wells, obviously, if you know that his contemporaries, you know that he was also best friends with Bertrand Russell, who is this, I see on TikTok and on other places that I wouldn't expect, people still fawning over Bertrand Russell like he was a saint and he's the father of modern scientific thinking and whatever. Bertrand Russell very explicitly believed in eugenics. He believed
Yeah.
in controlling breeding, human breeding, and wanted to breed sub races for doing hard work and other ones for ruling. And like his enlightened scientific opinion was horrifying if you understand he's writing before the Nazis, and then you have eugenics being explored in America and then in Germany afterwards. Hitler took inspiration from some of the eugenics in America.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this idea that science is just going to work for the greater good and that these technocrats, these scientific rulers can decide what's best for us. As somebody who's a big fan of 1984, but never believed that it was really about communism, I thought there has to be something else that explains why this resonates so much today when we still have, you know, like there are parallels, but this essay about the world state and saying very clearly that basically everybody who was young around that time looked up to H.G. Wells. All the thinking people thought that he had the answers. For me, that's a very solid basis for starting to talk about H.G. Or George Orwell, 1984, and sort of the criticisms, because Orwell, um, I could read another little quote here.
Yeah, and I do have a couple of follow-up questions for you. Do you want to do that quote, or do you want to?
Well, let's just see here. The quote is, you know, uh, creatures out of the dark ages have come marching into the present, Orwell says. He's talking during World War II. And if they are ghosts, they are at any rate ghosts which need a strong magic to lay them. The people who have shown the best understanding of fascism are either those who have suffered under it or those who have a fascist streak in themselves. A crude book like The Iron Heel, written nearly 30 years ago, is a truer prophecy of the future than either Brave New World or The Shape of Things to Come. Shape of Things to Come, I believe, was H.G. Wells.
Yeah,
Although I think I'm more familiar with it just as called Things to Come. I don't. Maybe the full title was Shape of Things to Come, but
I think
it's
there was
this.
a
I
movie way back in the 30s, um,
Right, H.G.
even the
Wells
late
movie.
20s, maybe. Yeah, The
Yeah,
Shape of Things.
it's an amazing movie. People should watch it because it is this very striking vision of a biological war that decimates the human population um, and the different, basically the way that a world government would emerge from the ruins of an all encapsulating total war that destroys everything. But yeah, so here we have, just again, he's listing the actual titles of the books that H.G. Wells writes and talks about how um, you know they're not true prophecies. They don't really understand the future properly because they're sort of, they're not crude enough. They don't tap into the the impulses of human nature enough, and I think that's why Orwell's uh, satire and his commentaries resonates so much longer, and he's so much better remembered for pointing out the dangers than H.G. Wells. But that is sort of the question is, if H.G. Wells had all of these disciples back in this time, and Orwell sort of saw himself as an underdog fighting against this giant of British thinking and intellectuals, which one ended up, having a bigger impact, and how much impact did H.G. Wells really have with this nonfiction and his essays that he has? So, uh, yeah, go ahead with the follow up questions.
Yeah, that I mean that really got me thinking about a couple things. Number one, the inconsistency that Orwell talks about. I was thinking about this because Wells was a working class guy, and so in a way, I can picture him um, using the Morlocks and the Eloi in the time machine. The Morlocks being a representative of the working class, and so you can see that Marxist idea of them being the ones that provide all the wealth and the comfort for the Eloi, which are basically just like these little beautiful 4 foot people that are up there laying around copulating and eating and you know
Right.
essentially living off of them in a very parasitic way, um, and then being eaten and oblivious and helpless. And so that ties into a resentment of the elite that
Yeah.
makes sense in a Marxist perspective. But then you have this idea that there's going to be these scientific elite that will be able to technocratically manage the population. And so
Mm.
it's such an inconsistent um, view to have. But
H.G.
but
Wells
because of the
definitely. Go ahead.
I was going to say because of that blind spot that he had for science that Orwell picks up on, that disregards the intrinsic human nature and that secular humanist evolutionary perspective that allows for a belief that as long as we evolve enough and our knowledge evolves enough and our we become advanced enough that the intrinsic good and evil that that we have in our nature as human beings, from like say the Christian worldview, you let go of that and you have this false sense of security when it comes to the science and the technology and knowledge being able to overcome what's intrinsically human, where Orwell was recognizing that that's inconsistent. The evil can still be done, it's just more advanced. There's more advanced tools being used to conduct the evil, and that blind spot that we see with the elites now, that believe in this.
Yeah. H.G. Wells believes genuinely in progress with a capital P. Just there is just such a thing as progress. The good will overcome the bad. The new will overcome the old. These things are just inevitable. And so the question is, who will define it, and how will it best be implemented? And he sees everything that doesn't conform with progress as sort of an aberration and a glitch, a mistake, a a small setback maybe, but you can't really have a full return to just evil. The progress must happen, and that's sort of what this whole essay that George Orwell wrote is saying. In fact, he starts by quoting H.G. Wells and talking about how um, Hitler is running out of steam, and he's about to lose, and Germans are demoralized, and they don't want to, basically, just left to their own, they will just fall apart because they're not on the side of progress, and so they're just sort of automatically doomed to lose. And Orwell is saying, why are they, whatever, he's quoting actual current events at the time. Why are they attacking this place? Why are they doing that? It looks very much to me like they're going to keep going until somebody stops them. And it's not good enough to just publish articles to say, you know, look at them. They belong to an old past that doesn't work anymore. That's not going to stop them. There needs to be an equal offensive and something to stop them. So it's a very practical look at how uh, H.G. Wells is sort of out of touch, and he talks about how he grew up in a different era where these sort of horrors weren't happening, and so you could afford to sort of speculate on the future a lot more, um, in this utopian sort of way of thinking. And to that end, I want to uh, point people towards, you can just go to archive.org and look up a lot of H.G. Wells' old books, and you don't have to pay anything. You can just, has a beautiful display where you can read these things for free on the Internet Archive. And H.G. Wells published a small book, really more like a booklet, called The Rights of Man. And in that, I'll read a quote from H.G. Wells here. He says, plainly, this is H.G. Wells, not Orwell.
Hmm.
Plainly, I am an extreme revolutionary. Although I dislike rhetoric and emotion intensely, that's key when you talk about Orwell. He dislikes rhetoric and emotion intensely, meaning I like to just be intellectual and simple and honest. And he sort of, that's where he talks about the sort of this common sense world state. Um, he doesn't want to have to rally people with stirring nationalistic speeches or appeal to some god or some other thing. He doesn't like rhetoric, and he doesn't like emotion. He doesn't want emotion to factor in it. We should just be cold, calculating technocrats, and that's how we should get things done. Although he is, as in his own words, an extreme revolutionary. He says, although I dislike rhetoric and emotion intensely, my reason nevertheless compels me to be extreme. I do not believe it is possible to go on with the present way of living that prevails throughout the world, with the sovereign governments we have and the economic practices that prevail. So, sovereign national states and capitalism.
Hmm.
These sovereign governments have given us nothing but inconclusive wars on larger and larger scale, and we have to get rid of them all. This is this is the science fiction author, Orwell, talking about the rights of man. We have to get rid of sovereign governments. He says all of them. It is not the present German government we are fighting to get rid of. It is any government of that sort, including most emphatically our own. So this would be treason. This would be, just a straight up declaration that our own government, and he's obviously talking about Britain himself,
Hmm.
needs to be destroyed. They have to get rid of it. We have to get rid of and replace, this is continuing the quote, we have to get rid of and replace all these governments by a world system. And that alone is world revolution. So
Yeah.
it's all there. During World War II with H.G. Wells, a cold, calculating, rational, technocratic world system that destroys national governments, destroys national sovereignty, including his own. He's not making an exception. He wants all governments to capitulate and to be destroyed. And so, um, this is, and Orwell says he's the thought leader of that time.
Yeah.
It's actually a very direct connection between uh, H.G. Wells putting this kind of rhetoric out, an extreme revolutionary who nevertheless is not passionate and does not feel like he needs rhetoric. He's okay working behind the scenes. He's okay. Obviously he's trying to invite people into this thing rationally, but
Hmm.
there's no reason to think that those who are disciples of his wouldn't say, okay, we need to implement this through secrecy. We need to implement this through policies, one step, 1 inch at a time, here and there, in this sort of, there's a term for it when you do that. I forget what it's called. It's named
Like
after an old
Fabianism, the
Fabianist.
Fabian.
That's exactly it. Yes. Fabian socialism is this idea based on this old Roman general who Fabius, who uh, would always retreat if things got bad enough, and the enemy would think they're giving up because they're retreating, but actually he was just moving his forces, and then he would attack somewhere else, and he would never fully commit his entire force anywhere. He would do little strikes here, little strikes there, and just sort of whittle down his opponents through these smaller skirmishes. And the enemy would always try, in the name of honor and pride, to have a major one-on-one conflict and settle the whole thing all at once. And he was famous for never committing all of his forces anywhere, so that even if he lost somewhere, it didn't really, hurt his chances at the next one. He could always sort of split up and do more. And so socialism, through that, which I think perfectly describes this, is this sort of idea that one step at a time, everywhere, those who are part of this conspiracy will just um, will implement the world government through self-sabotage, essentially, through destroying their own governments. That's the best way to do it, to
Mm.
get into power and then erode the institutions from within through either outraging people with scandals, through self-destructive policies and just social manipulation. All of the things we see today, where we're like, why are the people in charge so stupid? Why are they so dumb? That's what everybody used to say, and now people are more aware that it's an actual conspiracy.
Mhm.
When I was growing up, it was almost impossible to convince anyone that there was a conspiracy. You just, even George Bush and these other people, they would just say they're stupid. They're just incompetent. They don't know how to govern. No, if they're a believer in this kind of philosophy, you can get yourself into power and then become an active saboteur against your own government. And that's what H.G. Wells was calling for. And I just, have to point out that H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy. Um,
Well, that's
the
good.
full the full title is The Open Conspiracy: Blueprints for a World Revolution. It was published in 1928. 28. So we're talking well before World War II. He was already 60 when he wrote it, and um,
And you've made this point a couple times throughout, but if for it to really sink in, is this is one of the foremost influencers of the time, we'll say, is talking openly about this stuff. And so the fact that it's carried forward um, as effectively as it has been is mind-boggling, the patience. But you see that in the eugenics movement too, which he was
mhm.
closely tied to and advocated for personally. But go ahead. I just the fact that if we put that in modern terms, we're talking about someone with the influential power, relatively speaking, of like a Joe Rogan, let's say, on the
Sure.
population. Not making any comparisons ideologically between the two, but someone that's very easy for people to recognize now, that has a massive influence on the population and how people think and what they're talking about.
Yeah, and which is why it annoys me so much that he's only remembered as a science fiction author. And Aldous Huxley or somebody will, with Brave New World, he's recognized as being more of a um, sort of a thought leader in this sort of picture of how things go. And it's like H.G. Wells, this is where I was also going to go with. I want to follow up on the open conspiracy just a little bit, because
Yeah.
that's worth pointing out what he was trying to really advocate for. But H.G. Wells's science fiction also is still reverberating today with the UAP phenomenon and
Mm.
the alien disclosures, if as they're being presented. It's all still from H.G. Wells's playbook. And so um, the open conspiracy, blueprints for a world revolution, literally called the open conspiracy because he says you can't have real world government and a real change, with one separate groups all over the place trying to do this. But you basically also can't contain the secret. you have to have an open conspiracy. You have to have people who buy into this ideology of his, bridging sort of through white papers, as they're called, through these official documents, through, big meetings like Davos, which just happened,
Mhm.
like the Bilderbergs, all these groups that they're not, they're secret, but they're not that secret. I mean, you can see that they're happening. You just aren't allowed in yourself. H.G. Wells was advocating for that in the open conspiracy. He wanted the intellectuals of the world to get together and just sort of hash it out in the open and admit, yes, we are working for a world government. We want to find a path towards this. And in the open conspiracy, he talks about, I believe that's the book. I've read a bunch of these ones, and I sometimes get them a little mixed up, but I'm pretty sure it was in the open conspiracy that he actually warns future leaders who buy into this open conspiracy that they're going to have to overcome their conscience and their moral qualms about things, because he says that, people, basically, rulers and technocrats and stuff, they don't like to destroy things that are beautiful and that are functional and that, have a lot of tradition and heritage and value. But you're going to have to get over that. He's basically saying you have to become evil. There will be, many beautiful people that you have to find ways to eliminate and suppress in order to, achieve this greater good that's going to take care of all of humankind. And obviously, with Hitler's Aryan ideology, you kind of see exactly what he's talking about. This, if we promote things that are beautiful, Hitler wanted this huge revival of beauty and Renaissance, and obviously a master race, and sort of just everything that was sort of ideal in his eyes, promote that. But, H.G. Wells is saying we're going to have to make the world a less beautiful place, maybe, sacrifice a bunch of stuff in order to achieve this. And so it's not just utopianism and the idea that everything will just get better if we put our heads together. He knows that there's a cost to this,
Mhm.
and he's just, advocating. Bertrand Russell was very much the same way. He knows that religion and traditional values are standing as an obstacle in the way of his idea of the scientific revolution. He's just saying, so what? We have the moral high ground as scientists because we represent progress, and
Mhm.
religion belongs to the past. And this appeal to aesthetic beauty or traditional values is just obsolete, and therefore it's okay for us to destroy it and replace it. And so he's actually cautioning about this stuff.
One of the
Uh,
things,
Go ahead.
or one of the things that always blows my mind is um, how how much influence our formative years can have on our lives, and not only that, when it turns into when someone becomes as influential as H.G. Wells was, um, and still is, how how much that can ripple out to other people. So, coming from a working class family, his dad belonged to a group called the Freethinkers, I believe, and so they were. I wouldn't even. I don't know if they were atheist or agnostic, but basically they were very much what he espouses, the ideas of um, a very functional life, and everything is based on empiricism. And
Right.
so, and his mother was a religious lady. She had a faith, and she was devout to her faith, and she wasn't even able to live with them because of the way their living arrangement. So the mother and the father were separated. He lived with the father, and so he comes up with this father who has these ideas about the world and how it's empirical only, and
Right.
very materialistic, and you have to get rid of that. And so to see like a young H.G. Wells seeing his mother away working in the factory and with her ancient traditions
Mm.
and her thoughts. I don't know. It just struck me like I wonder
I
how
hadn't thought
much
about that. Yeah.
I wonder how much of that you know turned him into the man he was intellectually. Just trying to humanize.
Right.
Um,
Because I know that I'm pretty sure it was H.G. Wells who was, um, yeah, he was sort of an outsider within the really snobby upper class, um, uh, s- not secret societies, but book clubs or whatever they were called at the time, like um, Cecil Rhodes and Milner and these different guys who were uh, really sort of like old British colonial thinkers who just wanted to have the Anglo Empire, continue forever and just have this British supremacy over all the subhuman species, and they were always incorporating eugenics logic and race theory into why they deserve to just permanently be on top. And H.G. Wells was a an outsider within that group who nevertheless, won over a bunch of them and showed that the British Empire couldn't continue forever, if for no other reason than the fact that it would continue to provoke people more and more the more successful it was. It kind of had to go underground and become a an enlightenment movement so that they could lead the next phase where it's a world government obviously being led by this British, effort, to seduce in America and these other nations and to come, that's what happens in World War II is they get America to come and save Britain, and they're just, best of buddies ever since. Um, it's sort of like, stop trying to be a colonial power and start trying to be a appeal to the common person, appeal to the average people. That's why he puts out popular fiction that catches the attention of young people and becomes there's a fun element to it. And but they almost always do have a moral that ties back into his scheme, which is, one of his most famous works, The War of the Worlds, is entirely about how Britain is not prepared for a threat that is, big enough that because it is this colonial power, it's not prepared to think in terms of rapid response global efforts.
mhm,
And the alien phenomenon, as he proposes it, would be something that would unify countries. It would cross borders. It would not respect sovereignty. It's not a formal declaration of war. And so he's the underlying message of the War of the Worlds is, um, we need to have a global response to global problems. That's what else do you see constantly right now in our current day? Global
yeah,
warming and, global inequality. And again,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
today, the hearings in Congress about the aliens, the disclosure stuff, I'm paying attention to that stuff because I've seen this as from the back in the, you know, I grew up watching X Files and I thought it was an amazing show.
mhm,
Um, but it was all about, disclosure. When will the government actually reveal these things? That was sort of the whole point of the message of that show is that someday the government will actually disclose the truth. And that's when we can have this transformation in society. It's no longer going to be an X file. It will be official truth. And how will the population react to that? And that's happening now. They're pulling the trigger on that propaganda. And so you
yeah,
have the Pentagon, which controls all the information, leaking out these things to try to engage the public. And as I was listening to the congressmen in the oversight committees coming out of these briefings, I don't know where the best place is to find the video. I saw a clip of it on TikTok, but you can see them come out and talk to the press after this briefing. And now it's coming out, and that David Grush was his name, the whistleblower who sort of kickstarted this whole thing.
the quote
He
unquote
was
whistle. Yeah.
Right. Yes. The mouthpiece of the of the propaganda that they're choosing. Um, he's saying that this is interdimensional. It's not that they're from another planet. It's not that they're little green men. It's not what H.G. Wells proposed, which is literally Martians, coming in and they have their big eyes and their, tentacles and things like that. These are interdimensional beings that break the laws of physics, and so there's almost a hallucinogenic effect to it. It's mind warping. It doesn't work within our physical realm, and so there's a spiritual element essentially, um, with
Exactly.
the interdimensional side. And but the military is now going to disclose essentially that we don't live in a materialist world. There are other dimensions that break our laws of physics and defy all scientific reason, and we are going to have to somehow interface with them. And what does that mean? What do you get when you have the military advocating for essentially psychic or spiritual uh, action war, perhaps, against things that don't obey physics? You can't just shoot it with a bullet. You can't just destroy it with aircraft. These things are kind of spiritual beings. Maybe we need to have a new type of weaponized spiritual warfare. This is the direction the current disclosures are getting at. And it's been a very long process, a Fabian socialist type system of planting the seeds for this stuff. Uh, and I obviously, in my book, Firing the Rabbit Hole, try to take this to the logical extreme here, where they're basically saying demons are our possible allies if we
Yep.
negotiate this right. They're not destroying us, they're not killing us. They're trying to send us warnings. They're inviting us to, you know, review our policies. And what are these aliens? When we do hear about, people like David Grush or Stephen Greer and these other advocates going and talking about, it's always that they're not that bad. They're just trying to stop the nationalist sovereign governments with nuclear weapons from destroying the planet or the climate or the environment. They're always actually the stewards of the world. These
Mm.
interdimensional beings are trying to save us from ourselves. And so they
Like that.
can be
Like that terrible, just terrible Marvel Eternals.
right.
Yeah,
Yes,
thing along those lines.
exactly. And so um, again, I have to point out, because
Mm.
I made the points in Fire in the Rabbit Hole using whatever I had on hand at the time. And I think I got a good amount of substance in there about who was involved and where the stuff was coming from. But since
Yeah,
then, there's so much more I've learned about how actually sort of a straight line you can draw from H.G. Wells to the current day, with the War of the Worlds being this call to arms to stop thinking of your nation as being, safe and protected and having your sort of old fashioned beliefs. You have to have this willingness to have a globalist system, and that an alien threat would be the thing that would shock people uh, into giving up their regional sort of mentality and think in terms of a global team, a global partnership that could deal with something like that. And obviously, I can't believe I'm going to forget his name. Um, he's literally the guy that made Citizen Kane, and he made the American version of it. Um,
oh no,
Orson
Orson
Welles.
Welles.
Yeah, Orson Welles does the American version of War of the Worlds, and he takes it out of Britain and he puts it in New Jersey, and talks about how it's produced as a news broadcast,
Yeah,
and so then it gets a lot of Americans confused, especially in rural areas or places where they've never even heard of this kind of stuff before. There technically was a, like a warning that this is a fictional drama and whatever, but it was sensational enough that obviously it sort of proved the point that you could have this alarm being rung that America's not safe either. The little rural places, it could happen just like this any day. You're not expecting it. So this legacy of H.G. Wells is just all over the place. Um, Orwell was responding to him. Our idea of the aliens being this threat, this phenomenon that can come out and sort of capture the public imagination has been very carefully managed because you can hear from them that they one of the reasons why they trickle this stuff out so slowly and they're so precious about it is because they know that if they did some sort of data dump or they just sort of had a WikiLeaks, you know, treasure trove of stuff you could go dig through, it would actually lose its impact. It would not be sensational enough. They have to sort of stage manage the whole disclosure process so that there's time for people to speculate and then they can adjust their discussion around it and stuff because they're trying to go for it now. I believe it's going to tie in with this sort of World War III collapse, dollar collapse scenario when they create a crisis that's big enough that people are hopeless and they are, you know, economically broken and the dollar is worthless and there's hyperinflation and all whatever all happens. Uh, the point will be to plant these seeds now so that when the time comes, they can unveil the answers from these interdimensional enlightened, beings who presumably had some role to play in the evolution of mankind and they have been guiding us the whole time as loving masters that wanted us to understand our higher purpose and this very much a mystical element to it. And so H.G. Wells wasn't going in that direction. He wasn't trying to say that aliens were, it's not the same script, but it's using that inspiration, using that precedent, and then taking it in this because they can't, they basically can't uh, have CGI that's good enough or a hoax that's good enough. I believe that's a big reason why they're doing this with the interdimensional aspect. But I guess that's sort of a different topic. But it's to me very interesting to see actual congressmen coming out of a briefing and talking about how I can't tell you the details, but you know, we're not talking about little green men in there. There's a phenomenon that's interdimensional, and we have to sort of brace the public for this because it's going to, theoretically overturn all religions. It's going to overturn all traditional, spiritual knowledge. And so they're trying to prepare us, and the military is obviously trying to prepare these congressmen who are not in on it. It's not like they're all part of the same club. This is very controlled material, and they're trying to stage play it so that the right people in the right positions who represent the congressmen represent you and me. They represent the average people. They're the ones who will sort of be the messengers as they're in these committees and they have these hearings and they'll disclose things um, so
Well,
that it's not just somebody at the White House podium saying the aliens are real. It's like that would be too sloppy, that would be too blatant. They need to handle it the right way.
who on knows? I would say culturally, we've seen if you just look at Hollywood, um, we've seen a move from the more original spacemen, little green men, Martians. We've moved, and within the last, I'd say 2 decades for sure, I've seen more and more uh, of a creep of that interdimensional spiritual aspect, and we've also seen a big rise in this idea of the, I guess, what's called the Great Awakening too, and this idea of um,
Right.
how okay, we have quantum physics now, so we can spiritualize science, and um, now we have these multidimensional or interdimensional beings, and bringing ancient pantheons of gods into popular culture over and over and over again, rewritten and repurposed, and
Yeah.
put some nice long hair and some big muscles, and maybe an electric car. It'll look great. But the Thor and Tony Stark,
Yeah.
combination. But we've seen that move, and I think that the materialist perspective, that straight hard science perspective, that has fallen short. And so the spiritual, bringing back the spiritual aspect, and turning science into religion, um,
Right.
is very effective, because people are dying for a relationship with a god, on a human level. And if you can give them a god, and still have them deny sovereignty of the god, but these are some good people, or good aliens, or good interdimensional beings, that maybe they've been mistaken for gods in the past, but it's
Hmm.
science, really, and they're going to tell us how to live, and that way you can have a degree of separation from the actions that have to be taken in order to implement those policies.
I wouldn't even humor any of this. I wouldn't even care about any of it if I wasn't confronted by real people in my own life
Yeah.
and, even more online, obviously, who fully buy into that. Like, it's
Mhm.
not a hypothetical. Uh, I'm used to being around Christians who don't concern themselves with any of this stuff. But when I meet non-Christians, and if we're friends and we get into conversations, it doesn't take much for them to, in some way or another, say that they want to believe in something
Mhm.
beyond the normal rational bounds of daily life. They want to have something transcendental, and they will eventually say, if it's aliens, I'm all on board. They're prepared and ready to jump on this bandwagon. And you know, I can think of an example. Obviously, I'm not going to give the guy's name or anything, but somebody I know personally that was even hypothesizing that he had encountered aliens when he was younger. He had some sort of weird dream or something. And everybody's had some sort of experience in a dream, especially when you're younger, that you could remember in a certain way and say, I think I've had some sort of encounter that defies explanation, and it really mystifies you. So he really had no concrete experience that he could point to, but it's almost as if just that desperation, that hunger for a religious experience, he was already hyping himself up. And then as these things were happening, as these disclosures were happening, he would come and talk to me and try to, he knows that I'm a Christian. And so he's sort of challenging me that, look at this. What about this? How do you deal with this? These facts are coming out now. They're talking about it. And I'm just thinking, they've got you. They've got you exactly where they want you, starve you of spirituality, and then now present you with this transcendental thing, and then some cool counterculture figures like Elon Musk and Joe Rogan and not Bertrand Russell Brand. Um, they can go and promote psychedelics with science, and they promote the expansion of the consciousness and this sort of psychic pioneering and psychic exploration with spiritual experiences. And then they're sort of creating this narrative here and there, the Fabian system, where you never fully commit to one personality or one thing. It can be spread out. Um, they're constructing this narrative that, yeah, aliens were ancient, they were responsible for our evolution, and so they can sort of beta test all of these concepts in these podcasts and in these sort of, druggy experiences where these guys are just spitballing and they're seeing what works and what doesn't and what resonates with people. And you suddenly get millions and millions of people supporting this one episode of a podcast where this guy is going off on this epic rant about how aliens were, Jesus was basically one of the channeling some of these beings, or what, theosophy is really behind all of it, if you want to put a name to it.
Right.
This idea that all religions are one, and they are all just sort of a misunderstanding of the greater phenomenon of uh, whatever, insert whatever you want. It doesn't really matter because it's not a real philosophy. It's a placeholder that can continuously adapt to whatever needs to be said. Quantum physics, exactly like you pointed out, and like I talk about in my book, is this thing that they can pull out and they can say anything they want about. What are you going to disprove them? I mean, you can't do quantum science experiments. You can't, do string theory in your basement. So, what are you going to say? They have the upper hand. They have a monopoly on all this narrative, but then they can weave it into this syncretistic, uh, theosophical, mystical idea of all these religions being false. But there is a phenomenon, that they've all misunderstood, and that is what you should be exploring. And so it ties back into actually the same thing of that New World Order H.G. Wells talks about, of breaking down the culture, breaking down the borders between not only nations and official, uh, you know, states and policies and stuff like that, and having y- federal unions and global orders, but culture too, religions, erase the dividing lines between them, have one melting pot where we all give up on our religions, and now we just have, an understanding that Islam is no different from Christianity, is no different from Hinduism or anything else, because we were all basically just misunderstanding this one phenomenon that's been happening throughout history. And
A
so then,
unified theory. They're looking for a unified theory of everything.
yeah, but they don't want to push it as that. They would never want to label what they're doing and allow it to be targeted so directly, because then you could create a coherent response to it. That's
Mm.
why it annoys me again that we have the Great Awakening concept being pushed so generically as this umbrella term for what are actually at least five or six different agendas and working groups and think tanks that are trying to inject their agendas. You have the QAnon, Trump worship, apocalyptic sort of the storm that's going to kill all the pedophiles on one hand, and you
Mm.
have and they're trying to always leak a little bit of scripture into their stuff and make it sound like this is prophecy happening, and
Yep.
Trump is this prophetic figure and stuff. And then you can have um you know natural healing, holistic, um diet and whatever that appeals to a lot of women. It's a very it's good. Why would you not want to have a return to sort of ancient practices and find ancient remedies and medicines? Because genuinely, we all hate big pharma, and we hate how the our diets and our lifestyle has been corrupted by these corporations.
Yeah.
But the question is always, what's the solution? And so the solution is return to shamanistic, ancient practices. And that gets very closely tied in with the vibrations and manifesting and, you know, controlling your consciousness and manifesting your own future. And so if you have enough positive vibrations in your life, then, you can manifest whatever. And then that ties in with quantum theory, because that's all about vibrations at the substrate of reality. And so reality itself is just vibrations. And these concepts all get merged in the end into the great awakening, but they are not going to tell it to you the way I'm telling it to you, that these are different narratives, agendas that are converging to create this very much planned replacement, this what I call the green world order, or what theosophical people would call the age of Aquarius, this breakdown of the old world and the creation of a new world order with a new age that goes along with it, a new age of enlightenment that goes along with this new world where everything is broken down and all the people unify. But they want you to think that you're doing it yourself. You're discovering these things. You listened to the podcast. Your friend told you about vibrations and how he is manifesting it. It's not going to come from some one authoritative charismatic figure that's going to shove it down your throat or force it onto you. It's supposed to be this seduction into it. And that's really the major innovation since H.G. Wells, I think. H.G. Wells wanted to have a rational sort of open conspiracy where these people would appeal to the common person using logic and educate them on why this is the best thing. But what I'm understanding now as I look more and more into it is that failed. The United Nations theory of how to create this world federation, and that sort of petered out during the Cold War. And the mystic occult side of it had to try to take over and create the counterculture, the controlled counterculture that would then do the job. And those who are Wellesian open conspirators, they're still in those positions, sabotaging our governments and destroying our critical infrastructure, and erasing farmers and making sure that we can't sustain ourselves and we're unhealthy and all these things. They're still doing that. But on the other hand, as a flanking operation to get both sides, they're also implanting the cultural seeds of our own destruction as well, and erasing objectivity, erasing logical discussions, and creating these rabbit holes for people to go down, which all end up leading to that so-called awakening, the age of Aquarius. And I'm also noticing in a very one-to-one, day-to-day experience, especially if I actually post content on TikTok, um, Christians are being put in the crosshairs of all of this.
Yeah.
Christians especially are being put in the crosshairs because we represent the old order. We represent exclusive claims that Jesus is the only way to get salvation. He is the door. He is the shepherd. Jesus says, "You can't enter the kingdom by any other door. He is the door." And so
Mhm.
it's very offensive. It's hate speech. It's whatever they want to call it. It's the worst thing you can imagine in this age of Aquarius, is to have something that defies all other ideologies and all other spiritualities and says there is one source of life, and truth, the truth, the life, and the way. And if you're not on board with that, we're not going to kill you. We're not going to do anything to you. We're not going to even discriminate against you. But that's our belief. But that's not good enough, because I've even seen people talk about how we're disrupting their ability to manifest. You know,
Yeah, we're
we're
messing up those frequencies.
we're sending out the negative, pessimistic vibrations,
Mm.
um, very low vibration stuff, to be talking about Jesus being, the only path to salvation. And so, man, they sure hate that signal we're sending out. And so, the Great Awakening is also a campaign against traditional Christianity,
Yeah.
and it really comes full circle to a satanic conspiracy. Obviously, I believe,
Yeah.
and these people, whether they know it or not, a lot of people who are the best agents for Satan have no idea that that's what they are. I mean, Satan is the deceiver. So he's not going to tell you the truth of what he's getting you to do. It's not going to be a conscious decision to follow that in many ways. It's always going to have some veneer of something else to it. But obviously that's what I believe is going on. So
Well,
um,
we're warned. I was just reading in, I believe it was First John, uh, about Antichrist, and people culturally, many Christians picture some guy who might not look that much different than me, maybe some sort of malevolent looking guy with a goatee, uh, that's telling the world what to do. But what's being described is Antichrist is anything that doesn't declare that Christ is the Son of God, was
right.
made flesh, crucified, and rose. And so that hostility is going to, it shouldn't surprise us. What we should be on guard for is anything that from a Christian perspective, anything that denies that, anything that's
Mm,
universal like that, or that theosophical like that, should really get our hackles up. And that doesn't mean to be aggressive. It means, that's a warning sign, and say, okay, whatever's going on here, obviously something's off. Because I know a lot of people that are they're deceived, and they believe and they want the best for the people around them, and they think they're
sure.
doing the right thing and all that. So, it most people are not devious in the sense that in their everyday life they want other people to suffer or they hate other people. It's just that they've been so coerced into these tribalistic mindsets, and compartmentalized in all these different groups. But the one defining thing that really should separate it for Christians, should separate, is whether or not Christ is the center. And I know that that's off a little from our original topic, but
Well, in
it,
some
it,
ways
it
it
all
is, but
ties
it's
together.
yeah, because when you're dealing with a global conspiracy, it's exactly what the Bible predicted. The world becomes deceived more and more. People will increasingly be deceived as time goes on. And I would also point out in the Bible, in just literally the language of Hebrew and the term holy, people have a very deep misconception of what holiness means. It doesn't mean a magical power that comes from God or whatever. It's the term holy really refers to being separated.
Yeah,
And so the more holy you are, the more distinguished you are from the masses, from those who are deceived, for those who are um, not willing to, because it's understood that being part of the herd is appealing. It's understood that going along with the masses is the default. So to stand apart from that, like a prophet or like Jesus or like, God, they're all considered holy, not because they have a magic infusion of power, or they're completely, I mean, in the case of God and Jesus, obviously they're without fault and they do have miraculous power, but holy people in general would be a people who are separated. That's why Israel was supposed to be a holy people, not because they would be doing miracles constantly, but because they wouldn't do the practices of everyone else. And so Christians are supposed to be holy collectively and individually. And it all comes back to, are you willing to divide yourself from the rest of mankind? And guess what? That's exactly what Satan is trying to reverse with the New World Order, with the Age of Aquarius, with exactly the things we're talking about. It's about erasing divisions, lumping us back in, getting everyone on the same page, and having us subscribe to the same ideology, the same syncretistic, ecumenical is another word they use, where, that is about trying to unite the different denominations of Christianity, meaning go back to the Roman Catholic Church, come back to your mother church, as they often try to refer to themselves as, and then the Vatican itself has already acknowledged that they're willing to negotiate with aliens. They've already said that we all need to worship the earth and that it's, like our mother. And they've already become fully engaged in the process of transforming itself into the leader of this movement because they don't want to be left behind. They want to be the leader of the syncretistic theosophical world system if that's what it's going to be. They don't have any scruples about that. They can bend the logic any way they need to, just like they have throughout history. And so, um, you know, we are dealing with the exact same thing that the apostles were dealing with, and that uh, the Jews in the Old Testament were dealing with. It's always about being separate, and so
Mm.
it's always about being willing to, and that always comes with persecution. That always comes with a level of discomfort and a level of sacrifice to be willing to say, um, we're not going to make the same deal that you are. You've compromised something in order to belong to this collective. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to give up what the truth is in order to appeal to you. And that's where directly ties into faith in God. It directly ties into, well, if we're not going to have safety from being part of this whole system, if we're not going to have alliances and partnerships and be part of the herd, how do we stay safe? Who takes care of us? That's where God comes in. That's where you have faith in God. So it's actually just one continuous message from the Old Testament to today, which is reject the collective, reject this constant push, the Tower of Babel, literally in the, you know, right after the Noah's flood incident, you have mankind gathering together as one people in order to become this unified world order. I don't know if it's the United Nations or the EU, but one of them has a Tower of Babel as their headquarters building. They have an incomplete Tower of Babel as being their monument, um, and they are very much trying to recreate that one world government, the one system. And what did God do? He divided up all the languages, divided up all the people, and then he chose one of them to be separate from all the rest. So he doesn't want the collective with one, you know, one ideology unifying everyone. He wants to have a distinct people set apart. And so that is literally the moral from the dawn of mankind till today, and it just becomes more and more articulated as it goes on, to the point where you have Jesus talking about how you have to hate yourself and hate, even your own family will betray you, and even those in your own household will be against you if you follow him. That you will be completely isolated. There will be nobody. He talks about how in the end you'll have um, you know Christians betraying each other as the breakdown of society happens. And really you have to be prepared to go all the way, to be an individual martyr, and to stand up, and no matter what happens, what kind of pressure they put on you, to not compromise. And that's in my Substack that I do, the Winter Christian Substack. I'm trying to prepare people for that thought experiment, that possibility that in the next couple of years, possibly within the next 10 years, the as society breaks down and as chaos takes over and hatred ramps up, and you have this hardening of people's hearts and the lack of compassion, I fully believe that Christians will be put in the crosshairs, and it
Mhm.
will specifically be not because you call yourself a Christian. You can be a Christian if you're a progressive Christian, if you're liberal enough to just accept that everything is the same and Jesus is just you know, uh, another enlightened being like Buddha and like anyone else. They don't have a problem with that. It's the exclusive claims. It's the saying that we're not like you. That's what they hate. And so yeah, I'm all about that, and I do see the direct correlation to H.G. Wells, the one world government, the open conspiracy, all of it.
Yeah, and as they say, hell is paved. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and as we interact with people, and as we're confronted with all the various narratives, whether it's pro climate change or counter climate change, or pro vax or anti vax, or all there's so many different um, compartmentalized groups that people get so caught up in the game of of engaging with all these different topics and all these different, as you point out in your book Fire in the Rabbit Hole, all these different rabbit holes that and they end up wasting so much time and energy at each other's throats about things that are not truly consequential and don't really relate to their lives. And it's a lot of wasted time and energy in my perspective. And I know that some people don't even like to hear that because, it's like the my team is good, so don't talk bad about my team. But there's so many people out there that mean well, that are even pushing back against the globalist agenda, but they are doing so in a way that is actually perpetuating um, their own ineffectiveness in their lives. And that's why I advocate so much for people to um, unplug and get into the dirt and into the real world as much as possible, because it is that is where you find your individualism. That's where you find your personality, is in
Mm,
the relationships with the people around you in real life. And that's what God is. God is a Trinity, and relational in his very nature. And so that's what he wants for us and with us. And the division that we see out there, and the call for unification that isn't really unification, it's the killing of our holiness, our
mm,
separateness, our personalities.
right.
It's a constant assault against the individual personality, the unique personality that God created in you. And so I always try to advocate for people to to unplug as much as possible. Of course, I don't tell people to stick their head in the sand or anything. And obviously, I wouldn't have a podcast if I didn't think there was some value to
Yeah.
having conversations. But um, I really appreciate you coming on again and um, going through this thought experiment with us. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share? Anything that came to mind, or anything you want to sum up as we get near the end here?
Yeah, I would agree with what you just said, and I would also just add that I'm very sympathetic to what people are going through right now. We are living in an unprecedented time of deception and pressure. Psychological warfare is really what it is. And it is designed at the lowest level of youths, teens, kids scrolling TikTok, mothers, people who normally were never even close to these topics, never even within a mile of thinking about conspiracies and the breakdown of society and climate crisis destroying the planet or vaccines killing everyone. We I, for my whole life, I'm close to 40 by now. Um, it was impossible to even start to engage people in topics like this. Even when I was interested in it when I was younger, it was like way over their head and they didn't care.
Hmm.
Now I see on a very low level grandparents and just single moms and people who really were never in the war, so to speak, feeling very conflicted, very confused, wanting to have direction, wanting to feel like essentially that they can go back to having what you said. They can go back to having just a normal life and not have to think about these things. And so I'm very sympathetic to that because, I don't want everyone to become a researching nerd that goes and digs up these books and does all this research. Nobody should have to be doing that. But that's where they're getting us, is that they disrupt average life. They create a lockdown you can't ignore. They are preparing for these greater and greater signs and wonders, so to speak, to drag people into these conflicts and pick sides. And then when a person does take a stand, let's say like the vaccine or something like that, and they say, no, this I'm going to fight against, that's a brave effort to just reach out and to take a principled stand on something. But these people didn't want to, these people didn't want to be warriors. They didn't want to be involved in this. They wanted to be loved and have a good community and a family and just mind their own business and do their lives, because they're not trying to be culture warriors. And so I would encourage people to, in some sense, let go of that, because it is a trap, to try to go back to just being an individual and actually see that that itself is courageous, to not get sucked into the culture war and the psychological war, to become obsessed with the 2024 election that we're now, you know, who knows what kind of insanity is going to come out this year, revolving around that. So, we're looking at World War III, the Middle East, Iran, all these things. We're looking at these things. It's all timed out. It's all choreographed, I believe, on some level, to build up this narrative of the ultimate crisis, because they want every single person to be invested in that scenario. And so it actually takes a certain amount of stubbornness and grit to resist that and to say, I am just going to double down on my own personal life. Going, if you're a Christian, especially, I think studying your own Bible, and if you still have a church, go to your own church and help the people you can. And I think that is itself a sort of a heroic stand to take when the masses are being led into the rabbit holes. You can resist the rabbit holes and you can just do your own life.
That is the revolution. Just living just living in the real world is a revolution. But it's it I have a high respect for um people taking the time to dig through and read the books. I mean, I love learning for the sake of learning and to
Hmm.
expand my horizons, as long as you're able to understand that this is knowledge, and understanding the world around you is not a bad thing, but getting caught up in the
Right.
drama, it is where it goes sideways. So I appreciate people like you, Terry, that really take your time to dig into things and share your honest and very human perspective. Your Substack um, column, The Winter Christian. I've been reading that, and I've gotten a lot out of that. And like I said, we talked about your book, Fire in the Rabbit Hole. I read that, and I just started the maybe everyone was wrong. The
Oh yeah.
Revelations, the
Maybe everyone is
Revelation,
wrong. Yeah.
Revelation. Yeah. So um, I appreciate you greatly, and like I said, you always have an open invitation here on the Subtlecain podcast, and I'm sure we'll be talking again.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah. God bless you and your audience.